So now let's go to Lippmann. And again, what they have in common is that they both love democracy, and they think it's under attack, and they want to find some way to defend it. And also, like Niebuhr, Lippmann was once a very influential American. He was one of the most influential American journalists of the 20th century.
He was a columnist, right?
He was a columnist. He wrote books. He had a column originally in the New York Herald Tribune, and then he went to the Washington Post, and the owners of the Washington Post also, the Grahams also owned Newsweek, so he also had a column in Newsweek. He says at the heart of the problem is the substance of American political thought and the structure of the American political system. Unless we reform both of them, he says, then democracy in this country doesn't have much of a future. The problem with American political thought, he says, is its relativism. Here's what he writes. I see you have the book. Relativism is murdering us, he says. In the prevailing popular culture, all philosophies are the instruments of some man's, but he means prevailing popular culture, he means the American culture. All philosophies are the instruments of some man's purpose. All truths are self-centered and self-regarding, and all principles are the rationalizations of some special interest. There is no public criterion of the true and the false, of the right and the wrong, beyond that which the preponderant mass of voters, consumers, readers, and listeners happen at the moment to be supposed to want. Now, why do we insist on being relativists? Your teachers in the psychology department are all relativists. The teachers in the political science department are all relativists. Now, why did they defend relativism? I mean, what is, if you identified to them what they were, and you asked them, why are you defending relativism against the possibility of transcendence, that is, it's possible to have some kind of universal ideals of right and wrong, for example, what would they say? Why would they say that transcendence is dangerous for democracy? Why would they say that universal ideals of right or wrong are dangerous for democracy? We're the only country, for example, that doesn't have laws against hate speech. Remember that church, we always talked about it, from Kansas? Mm-hmm. They win in every courtroom. All these divergent justices that are supposed to represent the right and the left all agree.
Because you can't define it? You can't
that if you try to define it, they say, it's kind of like the NRA, it's a slippery slope. Before long, a tyrant will get hold of these so-called universal ideals and misdefine them purposefully for their own selfish purposes.
What was the phrase they used? It was something about like jurisprudence. Was it content neutral jurisprudence?
Exactly.
Like that?
That's exactly right. Whether they use that term or not, that's exactly what they're saying. So, for example, in that famous Supreme Court case where this gang of young thugs were angry that a black family was moving into their neighborhood, so they planted a burning cross on their lawn. Somewhere in Minnesota, exactly. St. Paul. And so St. Paul, Minnesota had laws against, they considered that to be hate speech. So they arrested him and put him in jail. They brought a case against him all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, again, we don't want to get into the business of defining right and wrong, what's hateful and what's not. It's the same argument that it's a slippery slope. And that Scalia, who was alive, who was a wise guy, said, you could put them in jail for burning wood on public property, on private property. But for burning a Ku Klux Klan cross, no. That's part of their freedom of speech. We have to be, as you correctly pointed out, content neutral on subjects like
I
that.
had a friend make an interesting point to me about that. What he was saying wasn't there, he was talking about like the neo-Nazi rallies and the problem with that, and he was talking about in World War II, in the course of World War II and afterwards, didn't we consider the Nazi Party an enemy, like an enemy entity of the United States during that war?
Of course. Yeah.
So if you are participating in that party, in that system, and isn't that treason?
Yes.
Not free speech, treason, right? I mean,
Well,
what you're
saying is that our supposedly content neutral approach to free speech, we're inconsistent.
obviously.
Well, there you are. So I think you're making an excellent point.
Well,
It's my friend's point.
Scalia didn't mind weighing in on stopping gay marriage, right? He's like, well, that's wrong. With the free speech.
I mean, her point is very well taken, and that's one of the criticisms of relativism, that it's inconsistently used. The irony is that the most murderous tyrannies in all of history were not based on universal ideals, but they were based on relativism. So that this fear that a belief in universal ideals will be the end of democracy, in fact, is not borne out by history. Yes, dear?
What are we talking about?
Relativism means that you refuse to believe in standards of right and wrong. That what you say is right, and even if I say something completely different, we're both right and we're both wrong at the same time. So if I say this is down and you say it's up, we're both right at the same time. And if I say this is up and you say it's down, we're both right at the same time. It's a refusal to come up with universal definitions.
And they say that nobody has the authority to,
Exactly.
to make a stand.
And she's absolutely right. She did a better job than me defining it. And the fear is that if you allow these definitions to exist, a dictator will put himself or herself in charge of these definitions and will, on purpose, misdefine them.
But why would they do that?
In order to gain power for themselves.
So,
But isn't that kind of like,
But what I'm
Circular
I just wanted to finish the point for her, but what I'm saying is that we're going to look at history for a second. The worst tyrants of all were not people who misdefined, M-I-S-D-E-F-I-N-E. Sounds like misdefined ideals. They were proud relativists. Yes.
I was going to say, doesn't that seem like kind of like some kind of circular logic to think that somebody's good? The only reason you would think that somebody's going to come along and even be able to change these definitions is because you believe they're relative in the first place, right? You believe they're changeable and easily augmentable.
But there were examples. I mean, this fear is not a ridiculous fear. Think about, for example, the Catholic Inquisition. They took Christianity, you understand, twisted it and turned it, and put innocent people to death on the basis of what they claimed were Christian principles.
Okay.
Think about the Salem witch trials on the basis of, again, what they thought were religious principles, universal principles. They put innocent people to death. So it's not as if that fear is completely false. It's simply exaggerated. Because as I'm going to show you in a second, the worst of all tyrants had no intention whatsoever of using. And of course, the worst was Hitler. We keep coming back to Hitler because he was the worst, the most murderous of all tyrants. Nazism has been called a revolution of nihilism. Do you know the term nihilism? What does it mean? Ism at the end, of course, a word means a belief in. So what is nihilism belief? And nihil in Latin means what?
I don't know what nihil means.
Well, it comes from like annihilation, the English word. It means belief in nothing. Belief in nothing.
Like
Yeah.
no purpose.
None. Except their own purposes, but no higher purpose. Nazism proudly subverted every idea and principle through hatred and murder.
Nihilism or Nazism?
Nazism was nihilism.
Right.
They proudly subverted every principle. That's what Hitler meant when he called National Socialism an irrational triumph of the will. Have you ever seen that? That woman directed, did this, it was a commercial for Nazism. You need to see it sometimes. You wonder how people could so easily fall for guys like Trump and Roy Moore. And they showed the spectacle of the Nazis. All these thousands of soldiers marching in lockstep, waving flags, and music playing, and these people who were in love with Hitler. And we look 50 years, 60, 70, 80 years later. I saw it, I guess, in the 1960s, so that was only 20 years later. And I think, who would fall for an idiot like this? But in the moment, people become mesmerized by these charismatic figures.
Yeah, and the more they say what you want to hear.
Triumph of the will.
So you're rational.
Do whatever you want to do. You're able to convince people to do whatever you want to do. There are no principles in that. The legitimacy of Hitler was based on the strength of his military and his secret police. When Hitler was warned early in his career, before he took control of Germany, that his actions were provocative and might provoke the opposition of the Pope, his response was, how many tank divisions does the Pope command? So if you fear, and it's not an unrealistic fear, that you have a culture that takes universal ideas seriously, that a thug will take advantage of these universal ideals. All you have to do is look at Hitler. He had no intention of using universal ideals.
If you believe in those universal ideals, are you one of those people who neighbor the children of
That's
light?
that's an excellent question. As long as you keep your pocketbook close to your vest. Remember the wisdom, what was it? The wisdom of the serpent, and combined with the
compassion or
of
kindness?
the dove, yeah. As long as you don't put down your guard, exactly.
Have you read a lot about the people who voted for Trump? Not like the Roy Moore people of Alabama or staunch Christians, but the Steve Bannon wing of the.
Yeah, it comes back to this term that we use, status anxiety. It's worse than you think.
Yes, but it's more than that. It's the nihilism, especially a lot of young white guys on the internet.
What is, I'm sure you're right. I mean, this is a very complex issue, and it's not just one thing, but just make sure we're on the same page. What does status anxiety mean? What does that mean?
I mean, like,
It comes from that historian Hofstadter in the book, The Paranoid Style in American Politics.
you think back, in the 1950s or whatever, if you're a white guy in America,
Yeah.
you have everything you need, and
That's
all the
exactly,
opportunity
yeah.
you need.
You're
but-
on top of the socioeconomic ladder, yeah.
Right, and then with no real threat of anything.
Exactly. And then who arrives?
Immigrants arrive, but it's also the
Women?
Yeah, women and
Blacks.
minorities. Yeah,
Mexicans?
it's like they are able to get that now, and suddenly not at the top.
That's it. So that is a lot of what provoked people to vote for Donald Trump. The fact that he's supposedly a self-proclaimed billionaire, white, that irony apparently didn't affect voters. But remember, what was his slogan?
Make America great again.
Right.
I'm going to bring you back. I'm going to bring white people back to be at the head of the socioeconomic pyramid.
So what are you reading in the alt-right?
The what?
What are you reading that's different than that?
It's like, I mean, that's certainly a thing. I mean, like with like say 50-year-old white guys or something like that. It's like, yeah, I remember the good old days, and like, they have status anxiety, but for the really young white guys, like, there's status anxiety too, but there's a nihilistic tinge to it. There's
I think you're right.
burn it down, like, haha, this will be really funny if Donald Trump's the
I
president.
think
This
you're
will be
right. But
hilarious.
what group predominantly voted for Trump? What did the
white
polls
men,
tell? What age?
older.
Over 65. And white women over 65.
Yeah.
That, of course, is the final irony. That Stockholm syndrome. People are angry. These old men are angry because they've lost their status to women, and women are voting with them.
How did
But I feel like those people vote would be the same people that would vote for Roy Moore too. Like they
I think you're making an excellent.
But like Steve Bannon has a different. It's not necessarily like rural country Christian like Steve Bannon. I'm sure doesn't care about.
They hate the
Christianity.
government. I mean, and I think there is a strain of nihilism, and I think you're absolutely right. An idea that government is evil as part of a philosophy of nihilism that doesn't believe in ideas. There's the inconsistency that you correctly pointed out.